Hi everyone, and welcome back to another session with the Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Quill Lakes on a talk about birds and biodiversity in the Prairie Pothole region. So before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to just acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan. So we have treaty number 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Dene Siouxland people. Saskatchewan is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I'd like to just acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people who have been on this land for centuries. So this conference is brought to you by the Citizens Environmental Alliance, and the goal is to increase awareness around farmland drainage and wetlands in Saskatchewan, as well as the different imperatives around this issue. So just a few housekeeping notes. Your mics are on mute. There is a question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard where you can type in your questions throughout the presentation, and we have a dedicated time after the presentation where I'll be moderating questions with Kyle here. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. So Kyle is the Saskatchewan Director at Birds Canada, and he is a member of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Science Team, having expertise in waterbirds and waterfowl. So his talk today will speak to how we know that we are losing wetlands, how we document and measure biodiversity with an emphasis on birds, of course, and how this information is used to understand the scale of the challenge that we face with conserving biodiversity under the prevailing land use. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Kyle.
Thanks, Lindsay. Let's see if I can get this show my screen right. Pop up the presentation. Let's see here, make it full screen. Everyone's seeing that, right? Or you're seeing it. I'm assuming everyone else is too. I'm gonna hide my webcam and there. I think I'm ready to go. So first, thanks for this opportunity and for challenging me to organize some thoughts around the topic of wetland drainage. There's a lot to go over. I hope that I found the right balance of information and messaging. My only concern is timing. I didn't do a test drive, so let's go because there's lots to talk about. Oops, that wasn't my advance. Let's see here. Let's try this one. Why is it not allowing me? There we go. So first and foremost, I want to recognize the contributors, and I put the talk together, but the contributors of this information are listed here alphabetically with the exception of the one on the bottom, and the reason for that is Leanne works with me here at Birds Canada, and she's my Saskatchewan Atlas coordinator, but she's helped me a lot with putting together this presentation. The rest of it's rest of the folks in there. At the top is Bob Clark. It's alphabetical, but he belongs at the top because he was the chair of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Science Committee for a number of years and served as a mentor and someone who we could go to and ask really tough questions of. I think all of us on the committee can speak to that. The rest of the committee members, if you see this ECCC, that's Environment and Climate Change Canada. S&T is the Science and Technology branch. CWS is the Canadian Wildlife Service. Jim DeVries from Ducks Unlimited is also a contributor. The rest of the folks on this list, Blake Bartson, Ann McKellar, Barry Robinson, Mike Watmow, all work for Environment and Climate Change Canada. And they're all members of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture Science Team. So a quick outline on what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what is a wetland. We're going to get into the details there a little bit. Then we're going to talk about how we know that we're losing wetlands. Then we're going to talk about how do we measure biodiversity, emphasis on birds. I'm the director at Birds Canada here in Saskatchewan. As it turns out, we also know more about birds than almost any other form of biodiversity. This is kind of convenient in the sense of that birds cover basically every area within the food web. We've got granivores, we've got frugivores, we've got, well, not so many frugivores in Saskatchewan, but we definitely have representation of birds of prey, birds that eat seeds, birds that eat insects, and covering all areas of the food web. So Birds can tell us something, and that's what I want to end on, is what are the birds telling us? We have different species and guilds that use different habitats, and there's a lot of signal and not much noise. So first and foremost, what is a wetland? All of us have seen puddles and potholes on the landscape, but what exactly is a wetland? A wetland is defined as land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity that's adapted to a wet environment grows in these places. Here in the northern Great Plains, the landscape was pockmarked by glaciation. These landscape pockmarks are the natural ponds and the wetlands that are characteristic of the region, giving rise to the colloquial name, the Prairie pothole region. This is what it looks like if you're a bird and you're flying, or this is what it can look like if you're a bird and you're flying over it. The region has long been seen as North America's duck factory, producing over 70% of the continent's duck production in wet years, so it's very significant from that perspective. I hope to convince you that it's very significant for myriad other perspectives, or from myriad other perspectives. So for what is a wetland, in the prairies, we have this great piece of work called Classification of Natural Ponds and Lakes in the Glacial Prairie region. This is a piece of work that's referred to by anyone in the profession. We all know it as Stewart and Cantrude. Came out in 1971. And it's an extensive document which describes a very useful classification system for prairie wetlands. We'll go over that with a couple of schematics, and then we'll show some examples and some photos. So here we have a schematic that came out of Ducks Unlimited's Agro-Manitoba Wetland Classification Guide, showing the different types of wetlands, class 1 through class 5. I'll mention a class 6 wetland when we get to showing some of the slides. But it's basically that we go from class 1 to class 5, and as we increase the amount, or not necessarily the amount, but the water permanency increases, so such that a class 1 is an ephemeral wetland, then we move to temporal and seasonal and semi-permanent, and then into permanent wetlands. So the degree of water permanence, that is the depth and duration of water presence on the landscape, that's what results in the formation of the wetland soil characteristics and the growth of different plant communities that are adapted to growing in these these conditions. This schematic shows, the classes 1 through 5 in concentric zones, because wetlands with multiple zones are pretty common, and it is that one zone will usually occupy the center of the wetland, while the other zones occur in concentric rings around the rest of the wetland, based on water depth and aspect and slope and all that kind of stuff that determines how deep a pond is, how steep the sides are, and so forth. So it's never as neat and uniform as in this schematic, but the schematic is here to help us understand something that can get pretty complex. But it's just that the plant communities and wetlands can be grouped into vegetation zones, and that those are important in wetland classification. So if we look at this next figure, also from the Ducks Unlimited Guide to Wetland Classification, this shows the transition of the vegetation zones from upland to open water that correspond with the different wetland classes. This myriad ponds of variable configuration and depth are responsible for the vast portion of the region's biodiversity. So let's take a quick look at an example of each one and which species might be found in association. So the class 1 ephemeral wetland, this is surface water that's maintained before the ice seal breaks. Most people would just see this as a mud puddle. The veg community at the greatest water depth is still the low prairie zone, so it's really, there's no aquatic wetland plants. So a lot of people don't see it as a wetland. They're often cultivated and seeded in the spring and dry or normal moisture years. When there is water in them, these are the species, or the groups of species, with some of them listed. This is going to be a familiar, so I'm going to, the format of the slide is going to be familiar as we go through this. So I'll stop here and just say that when it's wet, you can see that we get the dabbling ducks, geese, shorebirds, 33 species. Some of them breed here. Many of them move on into the boreal and Arctic regions. and 5 species of gulls. The ones that we have listed here are species that would use Class 1 wetlands, with the arrow indicating that it is an unlisted species that is in decline. Its population is declining, and the ones with the asterisks are already species at risk. So you can see that even though most people wouldn't see this as habitat, we know that some things use this. If we allow these places to rest and not be cropped into canola or something, when they're dry, they'll be used by smaller birds like sparrows for the seed. The graminoids that would be in there would produce native seeds and would feed these little guys. Killdeer, marble godwit, long-billed curlew, they're all shorebirds. People think about these things putting their face into wet substrates, but these guys that we have listed here will do both. Forage in the wet substrate and also up on the dry prairie for arthropods. So I know that these are looked at as easily cultivated areas, but they are an important part of the landscape. So the Class 2 temporary wetland, this one holds water for a short time in the spring, usually just 2 to 6 weeks. Of course, this depends on rainfall in the spring and other things, but they are typically drying up by mid-June. The veg is dominated by a wet meadow zone at the greatest depth, and we've got some plants, fine stem graminoids, sedges, rushes. These basins are usually cultivated in the spring. They will support crop growth in dry to normal years, and in wet years they will need to be seeded later. The species that use Class 2 wetlands are listed here. The yellow rail is a nocturnal marsh bird that's difficult to find, difficult to detect, but we do know its habitat preferences, and we're looking at it here. Again, so you're going to see, I'm going to keep alluding to these migrant shorebirds, and the reason why is because, as you all can appreciate, we go through wet and dry cycles. When we go through from a wet cycle into a dry cycle, the wetlands draw down, and as the wetlands draw down, they expose a variety of substrates. And this is the place where a lot of migrant shorebirds make their living, at least in terms of how they get their food. This is the most migratory taxa of birds, many of them going from South America to the Arctic regions in North America, and they got to have somewhere to stop and eat along the way. And we're looking at where they stop to eat. Well, where they used to stop to eat, but they will still stop in these places if we leave them there. So the Class 3 seasonal wetland, this is where surface water is present for an extended period throughout spring and into summer. It'll be late July if these things are going to dry up in a normal moisture year. The veg is dominated by a shallow marsh zone at the greatest depth. We're going to have slough grass, lots of sedges, some giant burrweed, and other plants that are that like this seasonal or this ephemeral kind of wet, dry environment. These wetlands may be used for hay once soils have dried below the shallow marsh zone, and you can drive something through there and hay it. These are the species that are known to use Class 3 wetlands, or that have an affinity for the Class 3 wetlands. Again, the migrant shorebirds show up. And I'm not suggesting that when these things are chock full of water that the migrant shorebirds are using all of them, but not all of them are never chock full of water. If we leave these basins on the landscape, there's always some variety of whether something's full or empty or somewhere in between, and that's what these birds are looking for, a good place for them to go have a bite to eat. So the Class 4 semi-permanent wetland, this is where water stays on the surface pretty much into September, October, almost every year, 4 out of 5 years. You'll notice these, I think this is probably what most people see as a wetland. Once we get some hardstem bulrush, some broadleaf cattail, I think that in most people's mind is like, wow, we're finally, looking at a wetland. These wetlands often develop an open water area with plants such as duckweed and bladderwort, sago pondweed. You can see for species listed, now we're looking at the ducks. It's not to say that the ducks don't use all of those other Class 1 through 3, but it's to say that some of the ducks make their livings in these places, like the divers will nest in these wetlands. overwater. The dabbling ducks will raise their kids in there after they've nested up on the prairie upland. And then you can see a variety of other what we call floaters, the grebes, coots. But you can see there's a variety of different animals here in terms of the habitat that they'll use. The marsh wren nests in the emergent vegetation. A lot of these species will use the emergent vegetation and the edges around there for foraging. Again, the migrant shorebirds show up because when these things are in a bit of drawdown, those birds will be in there. So the Class 5 wetland is a permanent wetland. It maintains surface water year-round. So 9 out of every 10 years, there's going to be water, maybe 10 out of 10 if we're in a real wet cycle. These wetlands are dominated by a permanent open water zone at the greatest depth. The water depth is too deep for plants, and so if this wetland happens to go dry during a dry spell, you'll see a dry, bare patch of ground present where there was open water, indicating that there was no emergent vegetation growing there. In these environments, it's primarily diving ducks. Of course, dabbling ducks will get in these places to loaf and to molt and all that, but in terms of a place for breeding and who makes their living here, it's the diving ducks. It's the bigger grebe, like the redneck grebes. It's Franklin's gulls, Forster's terns, and again, migrant shorebirds if this is drawing down and we got a little bit of shoreline for those animals to use. Okay, so the last class is a Class 6, the alkali wetland. These are extremely saline environments devoid of emergent vegetation. They often look like this with the kind of salt flats that are along the shoreline. They have species that are adapted for salty environments. And in terms of which birds use these, guess what? It's all the shorebirds. And I might point out that if you want to think about, well, what are these alkali lakes and how valuable they might be, and do we have any examples of ones that are super valuable? We do. It's called Chaplain Lake, very significant Western site, the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network, because we know that thousands and thousands of shorebirds pass through there as one of their places to have a bite to eat on their way, usually up into the Arctic for a lot of those species. The Quill Lakes, or the Quill Lake, used to be one of these places as well. It is still a Western site, but it is full of water and it is from agricultural drainage. And it is mostly affecting this group of birds, but several others for sure. Okay, so that's the Class 1 through 6 wetlands. How do we know that we're losing wetlands? I think if you have driven around on the prairies, everyone's probably witnessed something like this, some form of ditching or scraping to move water into ditches that might be along, near the side of the road. If you don't have a wetland near the side of the road, maybe you go big and you start moving water from multiple basins into a drainage system. So, there's plenty of examples of this where, we have kind of unfettered drainage, lack of kind of regulation, even though there might be set rules about it, it still occurs. And it's destructive, as you can see. It certainly puts, more dirt into production in terms of acreage, but it happens at variable scales, a basin at a time, and it just doesn't stop. So how do we know it doesn't stop, and what is the rate of wetland loss, and do we have some estimate of the drainage? The answers to those questions are, yeah, we do know something about this. And that's because back in 1985, some smart folks started the core of a network of transects, 153 transects that became the Prairie Habitat Monitoring Program, which is now led by Mike Wattenau at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Sampling was updated in 2001 to include 68 new transects, which became the data and the results that I'm going to report here. It's a 2017 report. It's available on the PHJV's website. This figure right here is showing you the region, and it's showing you the distribution of those transects. Okay, well, sure, we'll go to the next slide. I was about to do that. So those 221 transects got sampled. They average, they average 20 kilometers apart. They average 19.2 kilometers in length, and along the length of that, you can see this alternating quarter section on north or south of the road. All the transects are east-west, and the quarter sections are selected just systematically on either side of the road. This resulted in almost 5,200 quarter sections being sampled, sampling 350,000 hectares of land. That's 0.6% of the entire PHJV area. So that's even though it's a small number, that's very significant in the sample size. This effort sampled 56,586 wetlands, comprising 30,500 hectares of habitat. And so the idea is to use GIS to measure change detection. So when this has been done once, at some point again in the future, you do it again. And this is what allows you to come up with some conclusions like these. That report has a lot of information in it. I have just summarized the tip of the iceberg as it relates to wetlands. Try to, what's the big picture? Well, the big picture is 2.6% of wetlands were lost along the transect. If you look at that as an area loss, that's about 0.31% per year, or if you prefer, we lose 3% of our wetland area every 10 years. The basin loss is about 0.37 per year, or almost 4% of the basins are being lost every 10 years. So at some point that's going to have to slow down once there are less basins to remove, but it's not funny. The mean size of the lost basin is probably not very surprising. It's only 0.3 hectares. So most of the lost basins, 95% of them, are less than 1 hectare, and in total made up 67% of the area. Given what we know about wetlands, on the transects and what disappeared, we can project now to the entire PHJV area. And when we do that, we're losing 108, or we lost during that period, 108,000 hectares of wetland habitat. So it's from work like this and others like Blake Bartson's masters that we know that we're losing different types of wetlands at different rates. So independently, Blake found, independent of the PHJV habitat monitoring program, Blake's thesis found that we are losing the shallow ephemeral wetlands faster that are located in agricultural fields. These are the ones with the highest impact and the lowest recovery rates. So that's to say that, if water has a higher permanence, then it's because of its permanence, it's relatively more protected, but it's not protected by anything other than it's a pain in the bum to get the water out of there. So we're losing the shallow ephemeral wetlands more quickly as they are more at risk to cultivation when the basin is dry or to permanent drainage. In addition to the outright habitat loss of emergent marsh wetlands, oftentimes these will be drained into larger impoundments that are more lake-like, which support a very different biotic community in terms of both the aquatic and associated terrestrial species that use the aquatic environment. This landscape conversion ultimately affects species disproportionately because there are different communities that associate with different types of wetlands and marshes. And so the Prairie Habitat Monitoring Program permits an estimation of densities, wetland densities. So this ranged from 0.82 to over 64, just over 64 basins per square kilometer. We can estimate how many basins we have in the region, and that's over 9,156,000 basins. Sounds like a lot, but I'm telling you that we can't afford to lose any more of them. But knowing that information actually also permits folks to do what's called a cumulative loss analysis. And from that, you can project where losses occur, and you can see from that that it's non-uniform in distribution, with hot spots of intense drainage and large areas where it really doesn't occur. So now that we know the magnitude and the rate of wetland loss and where it occurs, what about the critters? Just going to check for time here, see how I'm doing. Okay, so how do we know about biodiversity? And again, like I said, I'm going to focus on birds, and we'll go through a bunch of different programs really quickly. I'm happy to, if anyone wants to contact me privately to learn more about any of these, I'm happy to answer those types of questions, because I'm glossing over a lot in terms of methods. So the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. This is really the kind of the first of any surveys in North America that started. The aerial survey began in 1955. The ground part of it came in 1961. The ground part of it is to deal with the correction factor that that not all birds can be detected from an aircraft, and so there's been a lot of work to figure out what the average correction factor will be, and then they, estimate one each year. This is what it looks like flying the transect, counting ducks and ponds on 200 meters on either side of the transect. This is what it looks like from, if you're looking at the zoomed out from space, so you can see that each one of the basins is marked, it's got a number, and the people that do the ground portion of this not only, look at each one of those wetlands, count the ducks on it, but they also do an assessment of the habitat in terms of how much water's in it, does the basin look impacted, does it look like it's recovering, and this is the data that Blake Bartson's work on his master's was based on. So you can see similar program in terms of the transect, slightly different methodologies, answering similar questions in terms, or coming up with similar conclusions in terms of which wetlands we're losing and why. So the Waterfowl Survey produces information like this that we can look at how is a population of a species of duck doing over time. I'm showing the mallard and the pintail here. Everyone knows what a mallard is. Everyone probably also knows what a pintail is. You may not know that it's one of our duck species that's in decline, because it has an affinity for native prairie and shallow wetlands. The Breeding Bird Survey, this is the primary source for critical quantitative data to evaluate the status of continental birds. And so this is trend estimation. How do we know when species are declining? The majority of that comes from the Breeding Bird Survey. There are some special surveys that have been started in recent years for shorebirds, but the majority of trend-based estimation comes from the Breeding Bird Survey. So if you're wondering, these are all the species that are either a species at risk or declining. The one in the green box are the ones related to grass in our region. The ones in the smaller blue box are wetland associated species that would also breed within the region. And this top box here showing 14 of 25 shorebird species either listed or in a state of significant decline, or these arrows that are angled like that is to signify that this is a bird that's going to be significantly declining if things don't change. So that's to say that this is where a lot of the information comes from, and you can see that we have tons of different species that are in trouble, even if you only pay attention to the ones that are breeding here, because we can excuse that the migrants aren't here long enough to think of them either. Breeding bird atlases, this is something that has my full attention right now, because Saskatchewan actually has a breeding bird atlas ongoing. We're entering year 5, but these are 5-year projects, a 5-year data collection, and they are looking at changes in species distribution throughout its range. They are projects that are planned to co-occur every 20 years, and they collect information in the form of checklists and point counts. And so these avian point counts, which are where someone stands and counts the birds that they hear and see, it's a standardized sample that is widely accepted. There's been different methodologies in terms of how long it is and the way that we might record the information. That's caused some problems in the past, but they're not problems anymore with new methods of estimation. The breeding bird atlases seek to produce maps like you're looking at right here. This is just showing one for the Blackburnian warbler in regions where breeding bird atlases have been completed. And so we're looking at the relative abundance of birds across, the portions of Canada where breeding bird atlases have occurred. The Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute is a provincial monitoring institute, obviously for Alberta. They're worth mentioning because they're very unique in terms of the prairie provinces and the type of information that they collect, the long-term data sets that they have over wide areas of the province. But this is to say this is another source of point count information, and the institute is an open source institute who looks to help people answer questions. And so their data, usually with some kind of an agreement around use, is made available when questions are needing to be answered. So let's just say that all of these informations about different animals, the numbers of them and where they are in the landscape, now that can be used to produce models. And what I'm showing you here is the waterfowl productivity model. I'm showing this one first because we know more about waterfowl than we do any other taxa in terms of not only where they are, which habitats they like, but also which places they're more likely to be successful in producing young. And that's what we're looking at here is a waterfowl productivity model. If you don't have that productivity information, which is where we're at for a lot of the other species of birds, we might have it for the odd species here and there, but we don't have it holistically for all of them. And as a matter of fact, until recently, we didn't even have a lot of strong distribution models for each species. And that was actually where I started my work with the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture, working on marsh bird models. And so this is just showing a composite of occupancy of marsh birds for 10 different species that were in different areas or different habitat types within wetlands. And so these models help move us from beyond just waterfowl into other water birds. Since then, there's been a lot of work done on all birds conservation planning. And I'm going to show you the next few slides I'm showing is some work that Barry Robinson, Environment Climate Change Canada has been working on. And this is to do all bird conservation planning for, as it says, all birds for the joint venture. And so this was based on 74,000 point counts. The point counts come from all those programs that I told you about, the breeding bird survey, the breeding bird atlases, ABMI data, and then also a few graduate students who had done point counts within the region and made their work or their data available. So when you grab data from a bunch of different places, they're oftentimes collected in similar ways, but maybe not exactly the same, and that's been a problem in the past, but the methods are there to mitigate those problems. It's maybe a bit of flute music and math for a lot of people, but it's there and it works. What we can do now that we have those models on the avian abundance, we can also combine that with explanatory things like habitat type or the amount of water on the landscape or elevation or weather covariates or vegetation green up indices. So that's just to say that we're seeking to link now the amount of animals to various features on the landscape. Once you do that for a bunch of species individually, you can roll them up into something that's a little more workable, and that we have to consider conservation planning for various different types of birds that have various different habitat affinities. And so these get rolled up into species groups, land birds, marsh birds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. And what I'm showing here is the most recent maps that Barry's been working on, showing where the best places are throughout the region to conserve habitats that would be focused on those specific groups. you know, the idea is to allow folks that maybe want to work on landbirds or work on just shorebirds to do that. Other times we might be looking to stack that and look at the entire community, and it's tools like this that give us the ability to do that. So the next thing to do with models is, now that we know where animals live and maybe how many you know, an area might support, you start to wonder. I mean, it's obvious that if you remove habitat, it seems like animals don't live there anymore, right? I think everyone can do that math, but how do you quantify that to learn about it? So Bob Clark, along with other colleagues, have begun working on this, where they've got based on empirical knowledge, they've made a simulated landscape with different basins, and we can simulate the removal of those basins, and we know something about the functional relations to which habitats animals will go into or not go into. And when we simulate basin change, we're simulating habitat change. So here's what it looks like. Its abundance of wetland birds is equal to some function of the amount of wetlands and amount of wetland area, taking into consideration landscape features like crop, pasture, trees, and what have you. If we look at that as a relationship, it looks something like this. So as we increase the wetland area within the landscape, the predicted abundance of birds increases to a point, and then it will, you know, asymptote and decline a bit. And that's just to recognize that as wetlands typically, our wetland area gets bigger and bigger, that at some point there's probably going to be, you know, it's going to be not so much emergent stuff and maybe more open water. That's what this relationship is the end of it is basically showing. But when you look at the model simulations, and Bob started with a landscape that had 46 basins in it. If you do 25% drain, you drain 25% of the water off, it actually removes 63% of the basins, because most of the basins or most of our water is in these smaller, shallower ones. And when you do that, we lose 46% of the avian diversity, or the bird abundance, all birds, so diversity is rolled up into that. If we drain 50% of the water, it's actually 85% of the basins, and we lose about 75% of the bird abundance. So yeah, it's not a good story, but this is, you know, this is all kind of the hard math, and, you know, like, well, which ones do we lose, and under what conditions are we going to lose? Some of those questions are super difficult to answer in terms of, well, is this a situation, you know, that's going to be, you know, result in this? But I thought it would be instructive to at least go through kind of what I'm going to call a pragmatic schematic virtual simulation, but it's empirically based on kind of what we know about species and habitats. And so if we look here, the box that's green represents a quarter section of native grass. You can see that we have some wetlands embedded in that. In this particular case, I've shown that, look, we've got the full gamut of wetlands within this quarter section. If we till it, or if we're gonna change, if the wetlands are going to become at risk, the first thing that has to happen is the grass gets removed. Okay, because there's no real motivation to remove a wetland that's in the middle of grass. And so the first thing we do is we remove the grass. And so we might have around the margins of some of these wetlands some remnant habitat types that would have some, you know, native grass, some shrub, maybe some tree in it, and what have you. And that will be some of the places that animals would continue to live. So if we start off with a simulation that looks at a quarter section that's got representation of all different types of wetlands in terms of their shallowness and the deepness, and I know it's a little bit of an ideal situation, because, you know, it's unlikely that a quarter section or the average quarter is going to have all of this on it, but it is to say that the average section might. So, you know, you can see that we've got a bunch of migrant birds that are going to use this quarter. We got a bunch of wetland species that are going to use the various wetlands. Some of them have affinities for shallow marsh. Some of them have affinities for deeper marsh. And then over here on the right, we have all of the upland species, many of them that are obligates to native prairie, some of them that don't necessarily need the native, extensive native prairie, but all of them need some amount of natural habitat. So we just got this quarter section, and now we want to make it productive in the agricultural sense, and we want to grow row crops on it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the grass, and along with that, depending on how dry it is or what have you in that first year, we might also be able to remove the class 1 and 2 wetlands. Certainly over some amount of time, there's going to be enough disturbance to those wetlands because the average person doesn't drive around those places unless they have water in them to eventually make those just go away. They'll just be tilled, it'll turn into dirt, and eventually it won't hold water, and those will go away. And you can see that when we've lost all the grass on the right side there, I've got the species that are faded, they still might be there. They probably won't make a great living on the landscape. But the ones that are crossed out are species that won't use that place. And that's the same thing over here for the water birds, or the wetland associated birds, that, you know, we can see that, well, the quarter section hasn't been obliterated for all of these things, but all of them are going to use this less because, at least in this case, the shallow marshes, or a couple of the shallow marsh types, have been lost. So if we continue on and actually we're successful and have a way to get all of this water off the quarter and into a ditch, you know, and so that there's nothing being really retained on the quarter, we're getting it off there as kind of quickly as possible. Well, you can see that there are no wetland associated species left, none. And over here, the species that are listed on the grass side of things, make a note that the top 4 are predators and have very large home ranges, and so it's likely that if these guys are still in that environment, that's because there's another quarter section nearby that still has habitat. The few passerines that will hang around, horned larks, vesper sparrows, savanna sparrows, 3 of the most common birds that you'll have on a point count in Prairie, Canada. 2 of them are in a state of decline, okay? And these species, if they're going to live on a quarter section like this, they're likely going to live in the ditch because there's not much left depending on how it gets cultivated. But it seems like less and less even weeds, less weeds even grow in a field. So if we're to do a slightly different simulation, one looking at a different quarter section, but this time we don't have the super shallow 1s and 2s. We just got a collection of 3s and 4s, and in this case we can't get all the water off the quarter. Maybe we can get some of it off the quarter, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna consolidate it into a basin because we're gonna free up more acreage to plant crops in. And so if we do that, again, this is what it looks like, and I'm going to have to, move, I think, through these slides a little bit, but this will be made available if people want to study, what gets lost and what have you, and if you want to challenge any of it, you're welcome to get in contact with us, and I'm really happy to have these types of conversations. So that's what the pragmatic virtual simulation looks like. Of course, if we can, get the dream and remove all of it, again, it's just this same group of kind of remnant species that are making a remnant life out of what's left on the landscape. So this is what that looks like in real life. I think everyone's seen this. Examples of this are in a lot of places. I guess I really hope that we're not waiting for better science to illuminate what should be fairly obvious. The habitat declines have been precipitous, and the landscape modifications continue, and the bird declines are telling of the story. So I was wondering if anyone remembers this guy. This guy first popped up in 1971 to warn of the consequences of unfettered conversion. He's popping up again today here in the middle of Prairie, Canada, taking the form of an ecologist who's advocating for change, speaking as the Saskatchewan Director of Birds Canada. Why do we need to change? Well, because the story on the prairies is largely reflective of this figure, which is found in the State of Canada's Birds 2019 report. The strongest signal when you look at these species that are in decline down here, that's the ones we're going to talk about, it's from the grass. And now if you look a bit more closely, there are plenty of signals for the wetland associated species too. Some examples of that are the declines in horned grebes, marble godwits, long-billed curlews, willets, northern pintail, American widgeon, black tern, northern harrier. So it's not a good story. Despite the optimism that we might see in this, 30% increase in wetland birds, because there's a lot that gets lost in a roll-up like this. It's not meant to be lost, but it does. But since we're looking at a roll-up of vast amounts of information, to simplify a message in a way such that people might take an interest, it suffices to say that the most rapidly declining species are all disproportionately reliant on the prairie ecosystem. The northern Great Plains, the prairie pothole region of North America. I don't know if I got this right, but the Pusqua is what the first people called the prairies. So it's had a name for a long time. And that formerly seemingly vast endless mosaic of grass and water, formerly teeming with life, that would lead science to conclude that grasslands are the most productive terrestrial ecosystems on the planet. Well, there's still places that are being depleted, a few acres at a time. Now at a collective rate of 1 acre of grass converted per minute across the entirety of the northern Great Plains. It's hardly noticed, but this is the beginning of the subsequent degradation of the basins that were formerly protected in a sea of grass. So remember that while we are all gathered here today to talk about wetland drainage, let's remember that water management is the final alteration, the final modifying of the landscape to suit the vicissitudes of humanity. Draining the wetland basins into watersheds and consolidating ponds is the final step to putting all potential acres into crop production and the homogenization of the environment and biodiversity. So the overview is not good. We're not headed for a good place for biodiversity. All models are wrong. Some models are useful, and we'll keep building better models that explain more of the variance, but models alone won't save us. So we're gonna have to do something. I think that consumers and markets offer some of the solution, especially if it's embedded in an adaptive management framework, and it can certainly help with the inertia, but we can't afford to let markets take control of all the natural capital. That wouldn't be wise, and we don't have time. Or what we're going to need is we're going to need more compassion for life. And we need that because science and technology have brought humanity plenty of assurances such that we're just way beyond simply surviving. But what's brought us in incredible levels of comfort and convenience, that is to human life, has become a great threat to our existence. And more as natural capital comes into production in the most anthropocentric of ways. So now ecological science is confirming what many have imagined to be the outcomes of such a remarkable change. The birds are the obvious signal, but let's not be fooled into thinking that because we haven't taken the time to catalog the lower forms of animals, that they are not also on their way out. Relative to birds, we know almost nothing about insects and arthropods. We hope to know more about these critters, but we don't have time, or I would even argue the mental aptitude to figure out and decide among this complexity of life which are useful and which can go. So technology might help to save us if we can distribute cleaner energy and healthy food that's grown on landscapes that are resilient with an abundance of other life forms. I wonder if we're really going to change, or if we're just going to sit around here and continue to ignore it. I don't think that what's happening is hard to understand. Sometimes I wonder if the exercise is just to figure out how little space we might need to afford nature and still get away with it. I don't think that's a good idea. Change is hard and it's often inconvenient. It requires conscious living. And this involves having the compassion to sometimes go around the inconveniences of space for others, rather than to just homogenize and plow over it. So instead, I guess, what does compassion look like on the prairies? I don't have a complete list, but I have a few things that I thought of. I think it's a cessation of the conversion of native prairie with the goal to recover more. I think it's a cessation of supporting draining and consolidating natural basins under the auspices of water management and security. It's leaving buffer strips around wetlands and other areas of perennial natural cover where other things can live. It's stopping the spraying of chemicals everywhere with prophylactic application, and especially in the ditches, which are the commons, I might add. But the ditches are some of the only places that are not under chemical application. It's going to be found in governance with the will to hold land corporations and investment portfolios accountable to what they're doing while extracting profits. It's just a decision to change is what it is. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I didn't leave a whole lot of time, but I've got a little bit of time, so have at her.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for that a very meaty presentation, might I say. I really appreciated those the pragmatic simulations. I think that really drives the point home, and you really see the impact of drainage and how what that actually means for birds. So as you mentioned, we do have a few questions. We'll just take we just have time for a few questions here. So the first one is, maybe this is in conjunction a bit with your simulation. So in your simulation, you had a few wetlands kind of being drained, and this is just looking at one quarter section. But really, if we're seeing, for example, one quarter section that's being drained adjacent to another quarter section where there's wetlands being preserved and whatnot, the question here is just how do one wetland being drained in relation to another impact birds and or other ecological systems? So whether that's the hydrology and soil moisture, but also habitat, does that put undue pressure on other adjacent wetlands?
So there's no definitive answer to that. We're still people are still studying kind of subsurface movement of water, and trying to understand which wetlands might be, interconnected, which ones might be independent. We actually don't have the time to kind of figure it out on the landscape for each one of them, and what all of those connections might be. How it affects animals it's going to depend on the animal. So an animal that has a larger home range size is going to be relatively more affected by a quarter section being changed to agriculture than something with a small home range size. And again, it gets demonstrably complicated in that, okay, well, I used my pragmatic simulation was done so because, well, you can never go, okay, well, in this scenario, okay, we remove the grass, but there's this marginal habitat that's left, and so, do you account for that? Well, yeah, you account for that, because marginal habitat, and if it's a small enough patch if it's a patch that a small critter can live in, it still is beneficial. Is that as beneficial as sitting in a full quarter section? No. And I'm not sure, I don't think this is the question that the person has asked, but I wonder sometimes if it's society is trying to challenge the scientists to answer these questions with kind of more and more mathematical specificity. And if we're waiting for that, I'm just going to say we don't have time for all of that. We actually know enough to start doing something. And that is to say that, yes, when you drain wetlands on a quarter section and then the quarter next to it, it is affected directly and indirectly and over different timescales. And how it's affected and what the impact is going to depend on what the question is. There's probably several questions embedded in that.
Okay,
Sorry.
yeah, thank you. Great. So another question that we have here is on the policy side of things. So one target that has been put forth by our policymakers here is to limit drainage to 50% based on wetland acreage. So not necessarily by wetland type, but area. And also that we could use upland or hayland to mitigate for drainage. So essentially creating buffer strips would be a mitigation strategy here. So just given some of the statistics that you have presented, do you think that we should be concerned, and how do you think that would maybe disproportionately affect birds here?
Well, I mean, that was shown in this slide in terms of just overall, one of these two slides, the model simulation showing, I mean, this is a model prediction, but it's based on empirical relationships that we know. And it wasn't a coincidence that 50% drainage was picked in this scenario, because we know that those are, I won't say they're the ambitions of the current government, but they're certainly the allowances of that government. And well, I mean, it's good. So it's going to, the actual answer to that question is going to differ, and it's going to depend on the landscape. But on average, given what we know about how shallow basins are lost first, smaller basins are easier to remove, and we know something about those rates. That's what's shown here in this model simulation. And it's saying that, look, if you say that you can remove 25% of the water on the landscape, it's likely going to result in 63% reduction in basins, and that's likely going to be an almost 50% reduction of the bird abundance in that landscape. This is a simulated landscape, but if we could roll up these numbers to a real and a large landscape, they're probably not very far off, because we know a lot about the processes that happen, like when wetlands get drained, which ones are more at risk, and how the water gets either moved off of the quarter or amalgamated on it. And all of that is encompassed in this model simulation. And so if we lose 50% of the wetland, or we allow 50% drainage throughout Saskatchewan, it's going to be a disaster for wetland associated birds and migrant shorebirds. And it's just, I don't even want to imagine that being what we're shooting for.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I see, I'm just mindful of the time here. So we do have some more questions in our question box here. But a lot of people are also just wondering, what's the best way to get in touch with you, and are you open to continuing the discussions after the presentation here?
I'm open for a couple of minutes because I've got something else to tend to. I'm certainly happy to have my email out there, but I will say if I get a deluge of them, then I'm going to look to try to see if there's any similarities in types of questions being asked. But yeah, please do. I mean, I want to. The only way we're going to fix this is if more and more people are having this conversation. So what I hoped was the result of today is that more people are going to see this and either think, man, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, I'm going to challenge it, or I actually trust this guy because I don't know why he would lie about it, and I'm going to go have some conversations with my neighbor because, like, we've got a problem here, Houston, like, over.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I think this has been a very thought-provoking and very informative presentation, and I think it's also quite equipping for people on the call here to see the data and to know that the data is out there and to know where to look for it, whether that's the modeling, whether it's the statistics. So, so thank you very much.
Well,
so with that,
I'm happy to have had the opportunity, and I'm happy to hear from folks. It's kdrake@birdscanada.org.
Perfect. All right. So with that, we have one more session with our Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. That session is happening tomorrow, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Jill Blakely. So if you'd like to register for that, you can do so at sierraclub.ca. Of course, if you want more information on the background of wetland drainage and how we've come to creating this conference here, we have the Incentrix report, which is housed on the Saskatchewan Environmental Society's website. And I'm sure most of us will also be looking up all these other resources that Cal has presented to us today as well. And if you want to go over this presentation, or if you've missed any other presentations that you're hoping to catch, you can do that at YouTube, and you can find these presentations recorded. And they're housed on Citizens Environmental Alliance-Saskatchewan's YouTube page there. And feel free to stay in touch. You can like, share, or follow Citizens Environmental Alliance Saskatchewan on Facebook. So once again, I just want to say thank you, Cal, for joining us today. And to all our listeners, have a good one, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow.
Thank you.